Workers across Britain have responded to a cost of living crisis by taking strike action. But Keir Starmer has found himself a spectator. That's in large part because the Labour leader can't decide where he stands on the basics. Here he is, asked about whether public sector workers should accept a real terms pay cut.
You said in your manifesto for your leadership a couple of years ago that you were the kind of man who stands up for working people, tackles insecure work and low pay. So on public sector pay, we now know that the pay review bodies are talking about 4-5%, well below inflation. So are you the kind of person who will say, no, public sector workers deserve more than that? I'll give you more than that.
Well, in these pay negotiations, obviously there are different bodies around the table with well-established procedures for deciding how to come to an agreement. I want that to play out. I think the negotiations get round the table, and
but would you give them what they want? Would you give them the money they want? That big inflation matching rise?
Well, that's a question for those around the table who are doing the negotiations.
It's like someone reading you an A-level textbook about industrial relations instead of someone taking a political position. You are leader of the opposition. If you have nothing to say about real terms pay cuts, what are you doing in that job? What are you doing in that job? Now, of course, that was specifically about public sector pay, but Starmer has had a similar approach to private sector workers, including, most notably, the RMT and everyone working on the railways. Starmer has responded to that dispute by banning Labour frontbenchers from visiting RMT picket lines. But in the latest round of that strike action, Shadow Transport Minister Sam Tarry defied his boss by visiting an RMT picket line. Here he is on Good Morning Britain.
If we don't make a stand today, people's lives could be lost. Some of the lowest paid workers are on strike today in the rail industry, safety critical workers, workers that make sure our railways get people to work and do so safely. It can't be accepted anymore that people just have to accept that inflation is out of control, the government's doing nothing on the cost of living crisis. And I tell you what's shameful, I believe strongly if we had a Labour government right now, this dispute wouldn't be happening because we would actually be around the table. And I tell you what, when Grant Shapps and Liz Truss come on the telly and say to you that it's someone else's fault, that it's the striking rail workers' fault that this dispute is happening, what a load of nonsense. The Trade Union Congress had a legal opinion just a few weeks ago that showed definitively that it is the government who are agitating for this dispute. And it needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved fairly and justly and quickly for the sake of the travelling public.
Can we just play to you what Sir Keir Starmer, your party leader, said to us yesterday morning on this programme?
The Labour Party in opposition needs to be the Labour Party in power, and a government doesn't go on picket lines. A government tries to resolve disputes.
So the leader of the Labour Party says you shouldn't be on a picket line, and you are on a picket line. Presumably he has to sack you by lunchtime.
I've no idea what Keir will decide to do, but I know this, that if Keir was in government right now, this dispute wouldn't be happening. We would be round the table making sure the RMT and TSA get a fair deal and making sure that happens as soon as possible. I have absolutely 100% confidence that any Labour Party MP will be in support of striking workers, people giving up a day's pay, a week's pay, or even longer. And by the way, this isn't just rail workers. We've now got the BMA talking about going on strike. We've got the communication workers, postal workers, people in BT. Industrial disputes are happening right across this country because the cost of living crisis is totally out of control. After 10 years of austerity, followed by people's wages in real terms not having risen in nearly a decade, any Labour leader will clearly be on the side of ordinary people, no matter what difficult decisions they have to take to make sure that they get the deal and the pay that they deserve.
Sam Tarry has now been sacked for crossing Starmer. A Labour spokesperson said this isn't about appearing on a picket line. Members of the front bench sign up to collective responsibility that includes media appearances being approved and speaking to agreed front bench positions. As a government in waiting, any breach of collective responsibility is taken extremely seriously, and for these reasons, Sam Tarry has been removed from the front bench. So Keir Starmer has decided to make his dividing line in the Labour Party. I'm the guy opposed to striking workers when we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. You can be with me or you can be with the guy who wants Britain to get a pay rise. Who are people going to choose? In any case, soon afterwards, Sam Tarry gave an interview to LBC's Ben Kentish. So this is Tarry, quote, "Across the Labour Party, we're going to see an awful lot of anger about what's gone on today. It was avoidable. It was unnecessary." And he says that Tarry claims Starmer has a, quote, "far worse relationship with trade unions than even Tony Blair did," and says today's events, quote, "wouldn't have happened under Tony Blair." One of LBC's correspondents added this: Sam Tarry, who was just sacked from the shadow cabinet, tells Ben Kentish he is, quote, "a Labour Party loyalist, but when asked if Starmer is doing a good job, he just says, quote, "I think he is doing the best job that he can." So it's faint praise, if I've ever heard any. This was Unite General Secretary Sharon Graham's response to the news. The UK Labour sacking of Sam Tarry for supporting working people on strike against cuts to their jobs and pay is another insult to the trade union movement. Quite frankly, it would be laughable if it were not so serious. Unite, of course, the largest private sector union in the country. I mean, historically has been Labour's biggest donor. That's in recent years, at least. Dahlia, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, Starmer has made these strikes a dividing line within his party. Is this smart politics?
Of course it isn't, from one angle. When you look at the data, the most recent survey data, you see that the strikes are actually quite popular amongst people, and particularly popular amongst the people that Keir Starmer says that he wants to reach out and to represent, particularly in the north of England, in the Red Wall. This is where the strikes are the most popular, because these are parts of the country that have a very strong memory of what happens to your community when the Labour movement is shattered into pieces. And it's very interesting to me that when it comes to, reactionary topics like being anti-immigration or being pro-NATO, Keir Starmer will essentially use the Red Wall, or his imagination of who the Red Wall is, as a human shield against criticism, and will sort of blame them for his own moral cowardice and lack of political imagination. But when it comes to supporting the strikes, he's not taking the lead from the people that he claims to want to win back. The strikes are also popular amongst Labour voters. Again, should be a key part of Keir Starmer's constituency. So I don't understand how it can be politically savvy to go against what is clearly popular amongst the base that you are trying to build in order to win an election. If you look at this from the perspective of a leader that is wanting to build grassroots power, is wanting to build a broad-based coalition of, all of the stakeholders that could potentially come together and not only put Labour in power, but actually keep a radical Labour Party in power. What his pathway to power actually looks like is essentially the Blairite model of getting into power, which is to essentially signal to the press-owning, class, the super rich, the wealthy, and essentially signal that, I am a safe pair of hands with your class interests, and befriending and becoming cozy essentially with the media, with the Murdoch press and sort of that kind of class. That is the Blairite model of power. And to be fair, in a sense, it worked. It did put Blair in power, but at what cost? Blairism laid the foundations for so much of the brutality that we are seeing today. And Blairism was a pale imitation of what a Labour Party should be doing, because they didn't empower Labour. They didn't empower the working class. And so what we are seeing in Keir Starmer being so ruthless with Sam Tarry in this way, it is clear now what he views as his pathway to power, which is not through building trust and building the political imagination of working class people and offering a genuine alternative to the system in which we live, but actually towards befriending who he sees as the actual people who can put him in power, which is essentially the media class. And he's signaling to them he is a safe pair of hands for their class interests. But what I find so outrageous about this is, first of all, any time a Tory or a Labour Party politician criticize workers for going on strike, the thing that I think of is you are such hypocrites. Even the Tory party are hypocrites, because what did the Tories do, the Tory front bench do, when they were not satisfied with their leader, with Boris Johnson? They withdrew their Labour. what did the Labour shadow front bench do when many of whom are now in the shadow front bench under Keir Starmer? What did many of those people do when they were unhappy with the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party? They withdrew their Labour. So clearly they understand that workers and people should have a right to strike, and that striking gets the goods. And that's precisely why they are trying to, either through criminalising the right to strike or by politically stigmatizing workers going on strike, to deprive working class people of the tool that they know actually gets the goods. And so with all that being said, I essentially think it's now time for the Labour Party to have a rebrand, because this is not the party of Labour. When you look at Liz Truss, the Conservative Party represents the interests of capital against the interests of Labour. When you look at Liz Truss, she was not neutral. She wasn't saying, oh, I'm going to let those around the negotiating table to decide. She firmly stood up for her class interests, and she said, not only am I in support of capitalists crushing Labour, but I'm actually going to step in and intervene with all of the might of the state to criminalise striking and actually help you crush Labour. Meanwhile, the person who's supposed to be representing Labour is either offering pathetic neutrality or, a kind of passive position, or is actually punishing those who express solidarity with the strikers. And so at this point, we don't have a political party in this country that represent Labour. Being the leader of something called the Labour Party is not given, it's earned. And I think Keir Starmer has proved himself to not be a responsible bearer of that very important title.
What about it really is, there are issues where the Labour Party, I can understand why for electoral reason, it sort of stands back and say, look, we're not really going to get involved in this one. So Brexit was one, obviously migration in the 2015 general election. Like, you might not agree with it, but it clearly, you can see the logic behind it. Whereas what Keir Starmer has decided to do here, the Tory government have said everyone in Britain should get a pay cut. And Labour have decided, oh, this isn't a winning issue for us. Oh, this is pretty dangerous for us. We're going to try and stay out of this one. It's like, really? Like, the Tories say everyone in Britain has to accept a real terms pay cut. And Labour will be like, oh, please don't ask me about that. He was asked, should everyone in the public sector accept a real terms pay cut? It's like, oh, God damn, they've asked me that question. I'm going to give my lines from the A-level textbook about how industrial disputes are resolved. It just seems so bizarre to me. Like, everyone in Britain is going to get a pay cut. Apart from the top 1%, as I said on Monday's show. This should be the issue on which you win the election. Like, if you're going to sidestep this issue, the whole country getting a pay cut, what are you hoping to win the next election on? Can you ask me about parties over lockdown again? Like, no, we've moved on. We're asking you about pay rises, and we want you to tell us whether or not everyone should get a pay cut or not. It's like, oh, can we talk about integrity? Can we talk about how I was director of public prosecutions? We've moved on, Keir Starmer. And also, we've moved on to a topic which should be good ground for the Labour Party to suddenly seem relevant. No, I don't think everyone should get a pay cut. It's not that difficult. Come on. Wow. I'm actually more angry about that than the strikes. I can see why Keir Starmer might not want to turn up to a picket line. He wants to look prime ministerial. I can see why he might, I would like him to go to the strikes, but I'm more angry about the fact that he has nothing to say about the whole country getting a pay cut. That to me just seems, I see no justification for it at all, other than, as you were suggesting, Dahlia, if this is all about appealing to Rupert Murdoch and saying, you can trust me because I'm willing to make everyone in Britain poorer if it protects profits.